So tonight we have Reiko from Revolution Books Berkeley in conversation with filmmaker Daffodil Altan, who made the Frontline documentary COVID's Hidden Toll. So you can join the conversation live in Facebook. This documentary, completed in the midst of the pandemic, is a visceral and shocking window into how the developing crisis of COVID-19 has hit vulnerable immigrants and undocumented workers, how an estimated tens of thousands have been infected and hundreds have died. And it exposes the cold negligence and brutality of the agricultural industry, the government institutions, and Trump. So Reiko,
hey,
8 past, you ready?
Hi, welcome. And welcome, Daffodil. We're
really excited. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
Yes, indeed. You know, I just visited my refrigerator and I had some things I wanted to show. This is how many of us encounter broccoli and cabbage and other vegetables. This is not what you're going to see this evening. And who are the people behind this? What are they living through and enduring, including in this pandemic? This film is very, very timely. As Katie said, it was done in the midst of this pandemic. And now there are fires raging all over California, including around and in the very fields where people work. So this could not be more relevant. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going technologically, we're challenged, but our intent is to show about 13 minutes of the film from the beginning, and then bring Daffodil and myself back and jump into a conversation. And people should feel free to type in their comments and their questions so that we can get into those as well in the conversation. So again, we'll show the film, about 13 minutes of this about hour-long film. I really encourage everybody to watch it on PBS. And then get into your questions. So I think we can go ahead and start, unless you wanted, Katie, what do you think? And now I can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Unless Daffodil has something to add before we roll tape, as they say, I think we're ready to begin.
No, I'm good. Let's let it speak for itself, and then we can get to the conversation.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, here we go. Fingers crossed. One second. Okay, I just wanted to go full screen.
Cuando yo lo escuché la primera vez que se iban a cerrar tiendas, restaurantes y todo eso, a mí sí me dio temor. Mi primer pensamiento fue protegernos, no salir de la casa. Sí, lo que es mi salud, no toco el tema con nadie. Yo tengo células cancerosas. pero en estos momentos nos hace trabajar más la necesidad que el mismo miedo que tenemos.
¿Ya viene, vecino?
Sí, vecina, ya te caigo.
Pues le encargo, vecino, porque me tiene aquí en el frío.
Ay, vecina, ahí voy, faltan 5 minutos, llegué a las 4.
Y nos estamos titiriteando aquí de frío, vecino. Apúrese, por favor.
Aquí vengo llegando, vecina, relaja.
Acá viene pelos. Mira el niño, ¿qué te dije? Buenos días. Parecemos sardinas enlatadas en esa van. 15 personas que vamos. Ahí sí no hay que respetar tus 3 pies. Ahí es de que todos como buenos hermanos juntitos y bien apachurraditos. Y así soy una trabajadora esencial. ¿Por qué? Porque nosotros cosechamos la verdura que la mayoría de las personas en este país ocupan su mesa. Nosotros salimos al campo, nos exponemos. No somos robots. No somos gente que porque trabajamos en el campo no nos vamos a contagiar. Nos vamos a contagiar.
Millions of farm workers now still in the fields across the nation.
Agricultural workers testing positive for COVID-19 is on the rise.
At least 10,000 meatpacking workers across the country have been infected.
Often facing crowded and unsanitary conditions with
Little or no protective gear, their lives and the nation's food supply are at risk.
As millions of Americans were sheltering in place over the past months, we began looking at the toll the coronavirus was taking on those who cannot stay home. Agricultural workers, many of them undocumented, who were deemed essential to the nation's food supply. I've been reporting in this community for years, and as the annual harvest was starting in California this spring, I was hearing from workers who were daily having to choose between their jobs and their health.
Todos los campesinos estamos haciendo un sacrificio grande por necesidad. Sobre todo es por necesidad, por hambre, por ver a nuestra familia comer y por tener donde vivir.
Cynthia Hernandez is one of the few workers out of dozens we spoke to who agreed to go on camera. She's a broccoli picker in the Salinas Valley, a region in California that produces most of the country's leafy greens. In addition to having cancer, Cynthia has diabetes, both of which put her at high risk for complications if she contracts COVID-19.
¿No nos están dando lo esencial para protegernos?
Mala, espérense.
She works for a contractor that supplies workers to farms in the area. She told me she's expected to bring her own mask to work.
Nosotros que estamos trabajando y tenemos tantas deudas y cuentas que pagar, el dinero a veces no nos alcanza ni para comprar una sola mascarilla, que en la tienda no lo dan. Una sola mascarilla, $3, $4. Y es desechable.
When we met Cynthia in April, there were no required COVID protections for farm workers, beyond general rules about masks and social distancing. Even now, companies don't have to tell workers about outbreaks.
Quiero tomarme hasta un ibuprofeno. Me duele mi garganta.
If one farm worker gets sick, you're going to get a crew, which is typically 30 people, sick. And if each of those people goes out, they're going to get 3 to 4 other people, because that's the infection rate. And so the thing snowballs.
Good morning. Good morning.
Dr. Max Cuevas runs a network of clinics in the Salinas Valley that primarily serves farm workers.
And so with my staff, I told them we need to plan with whatever little resources we have We need to plan to make sure that those resources are in fact available. So we thought, let's jump in, let's begin making masks.
Just before dawn, Dr. Cuevas' team was meeting workers as they caught rides to the fields.
Buenos días. Somos de la clínica de salud, estamos regalando máscaras. ¿Le gustaría? Ok. ¿Va a venir más gente? Somos de la clínica de salud, estamos dando máscaras. ¿Le gustaría una? ¿Le gustan máscaras? Estamos regalando máscaras. Una para ti, una para tu esposo. Máscaras, ¿quieren máscara?
When our state and federal governments announced that the farm worker was a part of the essential workforce, included with healthcare, first responders, police, it's not your middle class essential worker that people are talking about. This essential worker, a lot of them do in fact live in fear. They don't want people to know that they're here undocumented. There's that fear of, I could be gone tomorrow if I'm taken away, and what's going to happen to my family. It's a horrible kind of fear that people learn to live with. You try to assure them that don't be afraid of that one right now, be afraid of the virus.
By mid-April, the first cases of COVID-19 had been identified in the Salinas Valley, and there were increasing fears about it spreading among farm workers and their families.
En mi familia somos 11 en total en nuestra casa y pues parte son 4 niños, 2 niños con asma y sí me preocupé.
It was around this time that we met Rosa Orellana, a truck driver who was worried about what might happen in her family of produce workers.
No llegar a la casa por 15 días era la manera de proteger a mi familia. Pero pues tengo primos que viven en casa que tienen que trabajar en la lechuga.
Rosa's cousins were living with her family and working for a large grower called Tanamura and Antle. One of her cousins, Osmar, said that although the company gave them masks and gloves, it was still difficult to do the work and not get close.
Como somos bastantes personas en la cuadrilla, no se puede andar pues una distancia retirada, siempre toca andar cerca. En el trabajo no, pues ya usa los mismos baños uno, va a tomar agua al mismo lugar, pues donde vamos todos a tomar agua y al mismo baño, todo eso, no hay separación.
Y le pregunté, le digo, ¿los separan ahí? Dijo, no, vamos todos juntos en el autobús. En ese momento pensé, wow, va a estar difícil controlar a la enfermedad porque pues, están todos juntos.
Ya andaban pues varias personas con síntomas, pero nosotros los rateábamos con otro muchacho para el trabajo y ya andaba mal, también con mucha calentura y tenía tos también.
Osmar says he heard through coworkers that someone on his crew had tested positive for COVID-19, but his supervisors were not giving them any information about what was happening.
No los habían dicho nada, nomás los dijeron que si nos sentíamos mal, que nos quedáramos en casa. Tenía miedo. Estaba muy estresado en el trabajo pensando pues si los podíamos contagiar de la enfermedad. Pues todos estábamos con pánico, la verdad.
Without information and afraid they would get sick, his crew collectively decided to stop working. Osmar went home to self-quarantine, but he was already coming down with symptoms.
Ese viernes yo llegué a la casa, toqué la puerta a Osmar y le pregunté, ¿está enfermo? Y me dijo, sí, tengo calentura. Y ya él nos comentó de que en su cuadrilla alguien había salido positivo. En ese momento se
nos baja la sangre del cuerpo y no sabes, te pones frío.
Sabíamos que iba a pasar, pues entonces fue que decidimos nosotros ir a hacer la prueba.
Osmar went to get tested along with his wife and brother, who also worked at the company.
Primero le llamaron a mi esposa, pues le dijeron que ella había dado positivo. Y luego nos llamaron a mí y a mi hermano y pues nos dieron la misma información también que habíamos dado positivo.
Several other coworkers also tested positive. They were among the first farm workers in Monterey County to be diagnosed with COVID-19.
Entramos en pánico porque no sabíamos cuánto tiempo tenían de estar infectados y cuántos en nuestra casa podíamos estar infectados. Los niños, mi mamá, mi hermano, no sabíamos. Somos 11 personas, 4 niños, y si todos estamos infectados, ¿quién va a cuidar de nosotros? ¿O qué irá a pasar? ¿Qué vamos a hacer?
During this time, we were hearing that there were dozens of cases at Tanamura and Antle. So we wanted to talk to the company about the infections and what they were doing to protect workers, but they did not respond to our repeated requests for an interview.
Local produce.
Okay, so I hope that came through clearly for people. Reiko, I will pass it back to you.
Okay, Daffodil, are you there? If you are, could you put your video?
Here.
There you are. So that was very powerful. I know it might have been a little kind of jerky on our screen. It is beautiful when you stream it from PBS or YouTube, and I just recommend everybody go and see the whole thing. So welcome. I want to introduce, actually, you're back at Revolution Books for the second time.
It's true, it's true.
But this time it's our virtual space. And I'm so happy that you could take the time to do this. So everyone, please virtually welcome investigative journalist Daffodil J. Altan. And she is an Emmy-nominated producer and correspondent for Frontline PBS. You were nominated for the Emmy for this film, right?
Not yet. Not yet. I mean, I don't know what'll happen, but not for this one. It was actually for they're like a year. It's like the year before that the nominations come out for. So it was actually a film that we talked about at Rev Books here in Berkeley called Kids Caught in the Crackdown. That was about child asylum seekers in detention.
Yes, that was an excellent film, and I recommend that as well. And other documentaries that you have done or been a correspondent for, Trafficked in America, Rape on the Night Shift, and Rape in the Fields as well. And you are also a lecturer at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. So incredibly busy. So glad you could fit us in.
Glad to be here.
So this morning I woke up and I always look at Twitter in the morning, and I saw these images of farm workers right now in the fields, and there were like billowing clouds of smoke behind them as they bent over their work and were picking. It's just devastating and enraging. And also this morning on Twitter, I saw some pretty heartrending little tweets from people that said, I am just anxious about my parents being forced to go out and work in the fields today, even in the midst of this. So it is, as I said at the beginning, this is how many people encounter vegetables. They're wrapped in plastic, they're misted, they look wonderful and fresh, and maybe they're even organic, you know, but, and you can go to Whole Foods and get more if you run out. But how many people actually know what goes into bringing them into to our tables? What you don't see are the people who labor in the fields and the factories, and what you don't see is what their conditions of life are like. And that is why I really think your work is extremely important. And this film especially, everybody should see right now. I understand that this film was done in very short order in the midst of this pandemic. How can you talk a little bit about how you were able to do that, what you set out to uncover, and why?
Sure. So California was one of the it was the first state in the country to issue shelter-in-place orders. And so when that happened, we started talking, my co-producer and I, Andres Cediel, we started talking, and I started talking with my editors at Frontline, thinking about what should we do. There were conversations happening around what COVID stories could we do in the moment, what was realistic. You know, a lot of our production, a lot of our stories we travel around the country for. And this time we were sheltered in place, but I'm in California, and California is the largest agricultural producing state in the country. And so because we've been reporting in this community for, you know, I mean, a long time now, maybe over a decade, but we started thinking, well, the essential workforce, who is the essential workforce? What does this mean to be essential? To suddenly have this designation that you're critical to the nation's infrastructure, right? So you had multiple industries, businesses that were given this status. And that meant that you weren't, essentially it meant you weren't going to get to shelter in place, because what you do is so critical to the lives of Americans that you didn't have a choice. You would keep working. And they became, in many ways around the world, the heroes. You know, people outside their balconies in Italy cheering for the doctors and the nurses, and all the people doing this very important work, but the ones that persistently are invisible and unseen. In terms of even our reporting, and what we found over the years are the farm workers, the agricultural workers, and they were suddenly in this class of people. They were suddenly deemed essential and critical to the nation's infrastructure. But, you know, one of our first questions, and we started talking to, you know, reporters we'd reported in Rape in the Fields with, our colleagues, radio reporters, you know, talking to old sources. And one of our old subjects is actually in this film, from our film Rape in the Fields, because she lives here. She's a farm worker. And we wanted to find out, what is this going to mean for you? What are you going to need? What's going to change for you? Because just as there were shortages, PPE shortages for healthcare workers, there were shortages for everyone, as we all know and remember. And so this also applied to the agricultural worker. And so what we were hearing early on was, this is going to get bad. The harvest is coming. You know, farm workers who are California residents, but who go to Arizona and work for one season, are making their way back to California, and then they're going to go to Southern California, and then they're going to come up north. And so all of these various harvests happening at different times are going to mean something if this pandemic doesn't improve. And so none of us knew what was going to happen. This was in March, but we decided to start monitoring, talking to people, paying attention to what was going to happen in California and around the country, frankly, but where we would potentially start shooting and telling a story from would be here in California. And what bore out over the last, you know, 3 months was, yes, indeed, with the movement of more workers, with housing being as critical and as tight as it is in California, with the lack of PPE, without a set of mandated workplace protocols in place for employers to follow around COVID-19 protections. Nothing has been issued. Nothing was issued federally. All of these various factors have played into what we are now seeing, which is farm workers being disproportionately affected, agricultural workers, meat packing plants being disproportionately affected in terms of, huge infection numbers, large numbers of people dying, when it comes to meat processing and packing. And so what we were hearing in terms of the warnings from different sources is actually playing out. And so the film sort of tells this story as it's happening, because that's what happened. As we were reporting and finding people who to follow and whose stories to tell, people started getting sick. People started getting, infections started happening at the work site. And so we just essentially documented and followed that to sort of reveal the many vulnerabilities that the agricultural workforce faces.
So there are people I know whose jobs would be really difficult during the pandemic because it would expose them to the possibility of getting the virus. And a lot of people actually took leaves from their jobs, went on unemployment and, didn't go back because they didn't want to risk getting, the virus and passing it on to their family, their friends, their community. So maybe people would ask, well, why is that not happening here? Why don't the people just, not go to work? Why are they going to work and getting up at 3 a.m. every day and continuing to do this dangerous work?
Right. Well, not only do they not have the option to not work as essential workers, but they also need to work as just workers, because farm workers and agricultural workers are among the lowest paid in the country. Making $17,000 a year, you don't have a choice but to work when you're in that situation. And so what we were finding, and you hear directly from, the workers in the film, is, I want to stay home with my family, just like all of us did. I want to protect myself and my family, but I actually also need to work. So you have to make this choice every single day. Okay, I'm essential. I have to work. I want to stay home, but I have to work. If I don't work, I lose my job. I lose my home. My family can't eat. And so it's like madness, because you're negotiating all these things and you don't have a choice in the matter, and you can't, agricultural workers in different categories, some qualify for unemployment benefits and some don't. So, if you work in the fields, you actually, whether you're undocumented or not, you don't qualify, you can't collect unemployment. If you work in a factory, in a building, you can collect unemployment. So you can decide, I'm not going to work and I'm going to apply for unemployment. But then there were huge delays, as we all saw. And, Cynthia, who you meet in the film, who we just watched, she, one of the next sections of the film, you meet her family, and she has her mother living with her. She has 2 children, and she has 2 disabled siblings who, older siblings who cannot work. So she is the breadwinner for the entire family. So even though she has cancer. Yeah, even though she has cancer and diabetes and really probably wants to stay home, she can't afford to. So the choices that a lot of us have, farm workers, agricultural workers simply don't have. And I think that's one of the things that we were really trying to, demonstrate in the film, just by virtue of spending time with the workers and their stories. It's just to understand how little choice there is in their lives and what they're up against during a pandemic like this.
When did you begin work on this, and when did you finish and air it?
We started talking about it probably late March, right when we were in shelter in place. We started shooting in late April and then aired it late July. So we stopped shooting probably end of June. So really, really tiny little window that we had there to try to capture not only a moment, but then also do the reporting around what is going on. What does this mean? What kind of protections are out there? What should be out there? What isn't out there? There were a lot of questions that we were asking and trying to answer. Normally our investigations, we spend, a year and a half to 2 years on a film. So this was incredibly condensed. And then we were up against figuring out how to go out into the field with COVID. You know, to be honest, I was scared to go out. And that was where there was a real difference in the production of this story, where we were all sharing in this moment together, where we all had this sort of shared fear that we would talk about.
Wow. Very profound, I think. So what were the things that you found out? What was surprising to you? One thing I noted in the film is that, you know, you think, aren't there protections for people or whatever? And there's, you know, OSHA.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the film, you found out, well, OSHA has suggested guidelines. There's no laws that these manufacturers and farm owners have to follow. They're all suggested. What were some of the other things? And also, you could look at this. These are very, very moving and horrific stories from the people that you interviewed. But are they special, or were there just, you know, how many people did you talk to? I understand that not everyone was willing to be on camera, but was this the norm or not?
They definitely represented, they were definitely emblematic of patterns that we were finding both in California and then also people we were talking to in other parts of the country. You know, this was not just playing out like this in California. This was really kind of playing out very similarly across the country, and especially in California. And in some counties, you know, worse than others. But really, the issues at play, the systemic issues at play that so many agricultural workers face in terms of, you know, estimates are anywhere from half to 80% of the agricultural workforce is undocumented. That fact is resonant wherever you are in the country and in California. And the difficulty of being deemed essential, but also being criminalized while you're out there working and what that does to you, that was a pattern that was universal that we were finding. The challenges in seeking healthcare, the fear of having to pay for a test, not wanting to get tested because you're afraid of losing your job. So, you know, Cynthia and Osmar and Rosa and the workers that you meet in the film, they are emblematic of a pattern, but they were also extraordinary in their agency and their articulation of what was at stake. And so that's something that actually happens in the filmmaking process. Is we talk to dozens of people, not a lot. There's so much at stake. No one wants to get on camera and have a camera crew follow them around and worry about losing their job because you're bringing a camera crew to the work site. I mean, it takes a lot of logistical maneuvering on our part, but really a lot of risk on their part. And so when you find the person who's willing and has a desire to tell their story, that's when that's when you start shooting. And so we were not necessarily finding those people right away. It's challenging. We connected with our old source, Maricruz Ladino, who's in our film Rape in the Fields, and she's a kind of expert now. And so she appears in this film reflecting and talking about what the situation is more broadly, because she is somebody who's been through a lot and has a lot of agency now. But, you know, they are definitely representative of a pattern we were seeing throughout the state. And we were actually following multiple work outbreaks. We were following multiple cases that never even made it into the film. And that's a lot of what reporting is. There's like, you know, 75% of what you gather and who you talk to does not make it into the piece or into the film because of many different reasons, everything from not having anyone to go on camera to tell that story, to not having enough time, not having, you know, the necessary elements to tell certain stories for the film. But yeah, we were following a lot of stories. We were, you know, I was in touch with a woman whose husband died of COVID, who worked at a different meatpacking plant. That never made it into the film, but it was very real and it happened.
We had talked before that maybe we would show part of the film is about meatpacking workers. So I was wondering, are you able to show us that?
Yeah, I have it. I can play that clip.
Okay.
So just so I think
And maybe
I can...
set it up for us if it's necessary.
Yes. So so the other so what we decided as we were following the harvest in California, we also, what was happening simultaneously were meatpacking outbreaks around the country and also in California. And we realized that work environment, that situation where you're enclosed, you're very close to people. You know, it's like the hours, I mean, there's the shifts, there's just a lot of rotation. And so that particular universe, that story is part of the agricultural universe. And so we felt like it was important to also address the meatpacking situation. And so the film, part of the film does that. And we go into the narrative of facing meatpackers through an outbreak that we documented and followed that happened not so far, you know, within the Central Valley area of California. So this is a part of that segment.
Coronavirus pandemic is closing down meatpacking facilities across the country.
At least 22 meat processing plants already shut down in this country.
We heard about a growing outbreak a few hours from Salinas, at one of the biggest meat processors in the U.S.
Central Valley Meat Company in Hanford, that's about 30 miles.
Central Valley Meat employs around 700 people at its plant in Kings County. The company has a history of violating health and safety codes and has been cited for animal abuses, as seen in this undercover footage. In the last decade, it's had 2 beef recalls and been shut down 3 times. When the virus appeared at the plant in April, workers told us that at first the company did nothing to protect them.
When it started, they denied everything. It was people getting suspended for showing up with a face mask. A couple of people were actually coughing and they wore the mask just because they were coughing and they got sent home. They used the phrase, "You're scaring the employees, your co-workers."
Management will say that it's just rumors that someone had posted on social media.
A lot of people started missing and then they started calling them and threatening them about their jobs. They didn't show up back to work, they would be getting fired.
These 2 employees spoke to us on the condition that we not disclose their identities because they were afraid of losing their jobs.
In the Central Valley, at least 138 employees tested positive for COVID-19 at a meat.
They said it wasn't until the outbreak made the local news that the company began to implement safety measures.
After everything came out on the news, everybody's like kind of panicking.
After the outbreak, they started separating us in different tables apart. And then they were providing us with face masks because most of us were complaining. We were like, we need to protect ourselves.
According to the workers, more people kept showing up sick every day.
People were going in sick, fever, throwing up, coughing. They ask you at the gate, do you have any of these symptoms? You tell them yes, okay, you can go right down there, go ahead and work. It's like, shouldn't I go home? No, just go ahead and go to work.
They worked inside a plant they say looks similar to this one, and that even as the virus spread, the pressure to keep up production continued.
We still see people who have came back who are coughing and sneezing. They don't even cover their mouths because, you know, they're moving constantly because the line's, you know, running fast. And some of them, when they sneeze, the paper towels are kind of far away from them. So some of them, they just wipe it off on their face mask or on their smock.
Central Valley Meat declined our repeated requests to discuss the outbreak, but the company has publicly denied threatening to fire workers or punishing them for being out sick. In late April, the company sent a note to employees comparing the outbreak to a normal flu season and saying that the coronavirus is not some cloud floating around waiting to infect someone, and assured employees that nightly cleaning was killing any potential virus residue.
Early on in the pandemic outbreak inside plants, it was chaos, it was fear, it was anxiety.
I reached out to union leader Mark Lauritsen, who'd been monitoring outbreaks in plants around the country.
Nobody knew exactly what they were dealing with. And that just led to, if you were a worker in a meatpacking plant looking for answers, those answers were hard to come by early on in this pandemic.
So how big is this problem?
Just in meatpacking alone in the United States, over 14,000 of our members have been exposed or contracted COVID-19 because of their proximity to work. 14,000 people. And those are just our members. So you have to, if you look across the entire industry, you're probably looking at a number that's substantially higher than that. And when you have 14,000 of our members that are exposed and sick, that's a tremendous stress on the efficiency of the whole food supply chain in this country. And quite honestly, if we want to protect our food supply chain in this country, let's protect those workers.
Mr. President, on the food supply chain. In late April, large outbreaks were forcing plants around the country to close down until the president signed an executive order that prompted companies to stay open.
We're going to sign an executive order today, I believe, and that'll solve any liability problems.
When the president said that they weren't going to be closing the meat plants down, everybody got upset because we were just getting ready to close. At least that's what they were telling us.
Both of these Central Valley meat employees told us that they tested positive for COVID-19.
I started getting lightheaded. My body just started aching. I felt really hot from inside. My chest starting to hurt. I couldn't really breathe. I told my management, I asked them if I could leave, and then they were not going to let me go. They said that if you want to get tested, you'll have to go on your own time. We thought it should be the company's job to take care of us, the workers.
By early May, local health officials began testing workers on site.
I know a lot of the people that are sick. Some work next to me, some I see at the break room. I'll see them in the restrooms. Yesterday, a coworker showed up to work and she was coughing. She told us that she was threatened with her job if she didn't show up to work.
Production at the plant never stopped, even as the community around it developed one of the fastest infection growth rates in the country.
No, the company never closed. They didn't even shut down for not even a day. Even though it was 40 people working, we were still killing cows and still working.
Every day we go to work, we're thinking about the coronavirus, if we're going to catch it again, who's going to catch it, is it on the walls, is it on the product, is it on the equipment we use?
Up till today, I'm still going to work, even though I'm positive right now.
It doesn't feel like we're essential workers. It feels like we're slaves.
Nearly 200 workers at the company have tested positive for COVID-19, making it one of the largest outbreaks in the state. And around the country, it's estimated that at least 35,000 meatpacking workers have been infected, with more than 100 deaths.
Wow. Heavy stuff. I just thought about it today. I read this book about the meatpacking industry. It was a novel, actually, and I wanted to read a short quote from it. He's talking about immigrants. Here was a population, low class and mostly foreign, hanging always on the verge of starvation and dependent for its opportunities of life upon the whim of men every bit as brutal and unscrupulous as the old-time slave drivers. Under such circumstances, immorality was exactly as inevitable and as prevalent as it was under the system of slavery, of chattel slavery. This is from The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, 1906. It seems if you look at it in a more fundamental way, not a lot has changed. For these workers, they are still at the very bottom, compelled to work in dangerous conditions. And and, you know, compelled to do that just to barely survive. In your opinion, what is to blame for this? We're revolutions here at Revolution Books. You know, we think this is unnecessary, that it's caused by a system of capitalism that devours the people, and that the solution is actual revolution. But I was wondering, what do you think is the problem here, or the problems, and also how do the workers that you've talked to see it?
That's a great question. And yeah, I actually keep a copy of The Jungle on my desk because it's so relevant and resonant, and still almost too relevant and resonant today, which is, it's just, you know, you read, I mean, what you just read and what we just heard, there's such a resonance. And the feeling isn't, I think that sense, that moment where he says it feels like we're slaves, there's a visceral connection there, because I think there's a fundamental understanding that, you know, the most essential people from the beginning in this country have been the least free. The most essential workers, you know, who was building the country, they were the people who were enslaved, and who were the least free. And so what happens over the last 200 years to break out of that, you know, and the moment we're living in, I think all this reckoning that's happening, which is, it's happening now, it's been happening, but we're having another moment, right, where we're reckoning. And, you know, the changes that were made, the Fair Labor Standards Act, everything that has happened along the way in terms of changing labor laws for Americans, there's always been an effort. I mean, agricultural workers, especially field workers, have been kept out of a lot of those protections because the intention a lot of times was to keep African Americans, to keep Black people in this country out of those protections. So even as progress was being made, there was always an effort to not allow farm workers, agricultural workers, new Black farm owners to have the same protections and rights as other workers. And as the demographic has changed, that lack of protections, the fact that so many of the things that are in the Fair Labor Standards Act in terms of basic overtime pay, unemployment, these things that most people think that all workers have and take for granted, farm workers still don't get a lot of those protections. They were left out of that. And that was intentional because at the time, more farm workers were Black Americans, Chinese Americans. So sort of those racist intentions behind a lot of this legislation have kept farm workers very unprotected. And so there's this long history of both making progress, but also, you know, legislation and protections that have actively left farm workers out. And so that's why we find ourselves here today, where farm workers still don't have some of the most basic protections. And instead of, you know, being an enslaved worker, you are an undocumented worker. And just as, you know, being an enslaved person was not a permanent status, and that was forced, it needed to be changed. Being an undocumented farm worker doesn't need to be a permanent status. And I think that's where, you know, we're hitting a breaking point where the industry understands that they need this workforce. And there's actually worker shortages in California. So you cannot keep this population of workers undocumented and keep this status, because it creates so many problems, both for the industry. And this is talking about, I know you said revolution is, but you know, I'm talking within the framework of how do you make change within the system that is here. You know, what kind of protections do the workers need in the immediate? The immediate is COVID-19. But there are broader systemic issues outside of COVID-19 that persist. If it wasn't COVID-19, one of the pictures that was going around on social media of farm workers picking with a big fire, you know, huge fire clouds behind them, that was actually from 2018. So that was, you know, there are different images that are circulating, but there's one in particular that got a lot of shares, and that's actually, this has been the situation for farm workers. It's just that that's been highly exacerbated by this unprecedented pandemic that we're all living through. But, you know, just in the way that that it was wrong to keep a workforce enslaved. I think a lot of people are thinking about, do you keep a workforce in this undocumented, you know, sort of status where you then are criminalized, but you also are being told that you have rights as a worker. You can't, the unionization becomes very, you know, it's gray because you can't necessarily unionize. And actually farm workers, this is where the Fair Labor Standards, this is where laws don't apply to them. They can be penalized for trying to unionize. That actually doesn't apply in a lot of other workplaces. So, you know, when you don't really living in the shadows right now in this moment, especially being undocumented, it's sort of the root of many of the problems that farm workers face. Because when you feel like your very ability to work and be here depends on whether you're deported or not, you're not going to speak up. You're going to be much less likely to speak up. And so that's why people who do decide to speak up and who become agents of change within their communities and who are also undocumented are taking on incredible risk, but they're performing such essential work. They're picking the food, they're processing the meat that we all consume, that, you know, I think we need to ask ourselves, should they continue to be criminalized in such a way?
Well, the answer to that is no, no, 1,000 times no. You know, under a capitalist society, this is what has gone on for some time and is actually snowballing and accelerating forward under Trump. And, you know, I wonder if you could talk about that too. There was a ProPublica investigation that found that, you know, for years, the meat packers industry had been warned that a pandemic was coming and, you know, an urge to prepare for that. And yet they did not. Why not? And what, in your opinion, has the Trump administration done or not done to try to address this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, and actually that reporting, that excellent reporting that's been happening at ProPublica around meatpacking, I know both Mike and Bernice Young, who's actually one of the reporters, she was actually my colleague and one of the lead reporter on our film Rape on the Night Shift. So she's an excellent reporter, and they've been pulling all of these documents to really demonstrate these different patterns, whether it's, you know, the sharing of information around infection data and how that's been playing out in these rural health departments where you cannot, you know, you're having trouble getting infection data from these very large employers. And that, from a public health standpoint, is just, it doesn't help with the containment of a pandemic. You know, outside of whether this looks like bad press, it just doesn't help. And so in this scenario where they've uncovered, look, you've known about this, you were warned about this for a long time, you could have prepared. And I feel like that's a story that echoes, it's familiar in some ways, where you know you should have done something, you know you should have changed and prepared for this, and you didn't. And so the question we always ask is, what does that mean in terms of how do you value your workforce then? What do they mean to you? Because you didn't put these changes in place, you didn't prepare for this, and then you acted as if this was completely new and something you had never heard that you might have to deal with before. And that's what the story pointed out, right? Is that actually they were warned about this very thing happening and how, and this is what you should do. This is how you should be preparing for this. And so I think what we tried to do with the film, and I think what some of those photographs that have been circulating are demonstrating, and what we're trying to, one of the things we were trying to do with the film is just understand that these are real people living real lives. And what are their lives? Their lives are not that different than ours. They have families, they live They're longtime US residents. They are worried about coronavirus just like the rest of us. And so why do they not deserve to be protected in the same way that the rest of us are? You know, that's the fundamental question at the heart of reporting on vulnerable worker populations is why are they treated like they're expendable? They're human beings who are doing such critical work. Why are they not valued? And why are companies given permission? You know, why aren't they made to implement these changes? And so they are on some level. And I think, you know, the former director of Federal OSHA in the film says, you have guidelines for companies when they're voluntary. You have some employers that do truly care about their employees and are implementing, you know, are putting in everything. They're procuring masks. They're trying to do everything they can to protect their workforce because they know that their bottom line depends on their workforce. As crass as that is, they also, you know, we were speaking with a grower, he wasn't in the film, in Central California, who really just cares about his workforce. You know, he himself is Mexican American. And so it's not that all employers are bad per se, it's just that they're not all necessarily going to do the best for their workers, which is why, you know, the director who's in the film of Federal OSHA, the former director, says that's why we need standards in place that all employers have to follow to protect their workers, because you can't necessarily count on everyone to do the right thing. And as far as President Trump, and what's made the situation worse in the administration, I mean, one of the things that happened, as you saw in that clip, is the executive order that was issued was actually, it was almost like there was actually nothing binding in that order. There was nothing that said you have to stay open. He met with representatives from some of the larger meat packing companies days before that was issued. And basically what it did was it created this impression that they had to stay open, but there was nothing that said they had to do so. And it was really this bizarre kind of, you know, smokescreen that they threw up saying, well, this is critical and everything has to keep going. And really what, you know, another investigation found out was that meatpacking companies had record exports to China during that same time period when they were warning that there would be shortages in the US. So they were actually making additional profit when workers like the ones you just met in the film were falling sick. We're just asking for, please do deep cleanings of our plant. Please tell us what is happening. Please give us information. And so to see these two things against each other is just so stark and so disturbing, because that means that, you know, the executive order that was issued wasn't about protecting workers. It was about protecting the companies, the owners of these companies. The New Yorker also had a piece looking at, you know, a poultry processing plant and the owner's ties to President Trump, and he's a big donor. And so, you know, that's where there's a lot of unevenness in the agricultural industrial world, is you have many employers who are doing the best for their workers and you have many employers who aren't. And so when there's so much unevenness, what needs to happen on the federal level to mandate that they do certain things? And there was, you know, 23 unions sued at one point asking Federal OSHA for mandated emergency COVID-19 protections. And that lawsuit was struck down. So to date, there's nothing federally saying you have to do these 5 basic things for your employees at the work site. You don't even have to tell your workers that there's an infection at the work site. You know, privacy laws aside, not disclosing names, but just in terms of numbers and here's a plan, here's what we're going to do. You don't have to do any of that as an employer. And so I think that's been, you know, one issue in terms of that executive order and the Trump administration. The other, I think we're all familiar with, has been just the hard line against immigrants and undocumented immigrants. And the most recent being public charge rule, which was a rule that, you know, said that if you use public services and you are undocumented or you don't have, you know, a work visa, you know, if depending on where your status is, but if you use public services, you can be penalized later when you're trying to get a work permit or, you know, legalization, et cetera. And so even though medical services were not included in this in this public charge rule, the message that it sent, kind of like the executive order, it was like all this noise, but the message is so powerful that we were finding over and over again, hearing from doctors, hearing from workers, that it had an impact, that people were more reticent to seek medical care during the pandemic because they were afraid that it was going to be counted against them. They were afraid that it would somehow lead to their deportation. And during a public health crisis, you don't want critical workers who are potentially infected with COVID-19 to be afraid of seeking care because they're simultaneously being criminalized for not having documented status in the country. Oops, you're muted.
An intersecting storm of oppression and messed up stuff.
It's a lot.
This is a truly horrific. I feel like this would be a good moment for me to say some stuff about what's going on. I mean, the pandemic hasn't stopped people from getting rounded up by ICE. And what I saw that was good today was that people in Portland haven't stopped protesting, and in fact protested at ICE last night. And there is such a need for so much more to stop this regime that is hurtling us towards disaster. And so I wanted to say a little bit about what Revolution Books is doing right now. This is it's smoky out there. It's dangerous. And let's be real, we're living in a dangerous time in modern human history. Fascist regimes around the world are tearing this world to pieces. And the most powerful of these, the Trump-Pence regime, is barreling ahead. This is a time when all kinds of people need to join in and rise to what is a historic challenge. I wanted to mention this statement by Bob Avakian issued on August 1st. It's called "On the Immediate Critical Situation, the Urgent Need to Drive Out the Fascist Trump-Pence Regime, Voting in this Election, and the Fundamental Need for Revolution." And read a short quote from this. He says, "If this regime is able to further consolidate its power and make further leaps in implementing its horrific objectives, this will result in a devastating setback for any attempt to resist injustice and oppression, and will very likely lead to the brutal repression and even annihilation of defenders of democratic rights and proponents of any meaningful progressive reforms, as well as organized forces fighting for fundamental revolutionary change." So stepping up to that, their Revolution Books is trying to figure out what to do. We're not going away, we're not stepping back, but we're stepping up during this whole period. The pandemic, the elections, etc. Our bookstores have books on the history of fascism, on the new communism by Bob Avakian. Our bookstores are located in Harlem on one coast and Berkeley on the other, and people can see us and visit us online as well. Bring your understanding, come to our bookstore. The challenges that are facing humanity. You can also find the revolution clubs and join up with the movement for revolution. So in particular, and it will be announced more, Revolution Books has this idea of vision for doing 60 defiant days, guided by the statement that I read from by Bob Avakian. And this is going to be programming on the need to drive out this regime and on the fundamental need for revolution. There's going to be panels with scholars, social justice activists, writers, authors, filmmakers, open air discussions where we can have them safely, spoken word and musical performance as well. And topics like what happened in Nazi Germany, Trump and the COVID-19 crisis, the Black Lives Matter movement, and driving out the Trump regime. So stay tuned. We'll be announcing more in the days to come, and we'll be calling on everyone to give your ideas and help with this special programming. Also, I wanted to mention and urge people, there will be organization Refuse Fascism has put out a call for nationwide protests on September 5th. And you can find out where one is where you live, or you can make one of your own. But the idea is to strongly and determinedly kick off 60 days of struggle to oust the Trump-Pence regime. And this is really needed. People in the streets taking inspiration from Portland, from other countries where they've ousted their fascist or brutal regimes. This is really, really key. Massive, determined, nonviolent resistance in the streets. And when you look at things like the work of Daffodil, can we really do anything less? Are we simply consuming and thinking, or are we acting, and are we acting with others and really reaching out around this? So, I urge everybody to go online, see the statement by Bob Avakian, and also get involved with building for September 5th and beyond. So anyway, I wanted to ask a little bit more things, but we do have a question that I thought was good, and let's see. So Michael wrote in, thank you, Daffodil, and the courageous people that you interviewed, and has two related questions. Has the new public charge rule out in place by Trump in February had an impact in the fear of people seeking medical care, which you somewhat spoke to? And does the government track cases of COVID and deaths among workers, which I think is important and a complicated thing? Oh, now you're muted.
That's a good question. And actually, if you watch the full film, if you haven't seen it, it is something that we actually, we're actually dealing with in the film, is this lack of data when it comes to worker infections. We scoured the state. We were talking to the major ag producing counties in the state, and then it varies all across the country, but it was very difficult to get data on workers who were being infected by industry. Monterey County, where some of the story takes place, some of the characters are in Monterey County. They started releasing industry data in May. And so that was, they don't release company information, but they do break down infection numbers by industry. And so one of the earliest analyses of how this population is being affected was done with that data. The California Institute for Rural Studies did this analysis, and they found that farm workers, just based on finally having a county that was releasing this data weekly, they found that farm workers were 3 times as likely to get COVID-19 than any other worker in any other industry. So that was in itself is so revealing. And if we had data for all the counties, Monterey County still has, their infection numbers are going up, but they're still relatively low when you compare them to some of the other ag producing counties in the state that are in the 20,000 plus, when it comes to numbers and infections. And so, those counties are not releasing data by industry. Some counties, if you call and ask specifically, they will release company data by by company, if they have, if they meet a certain threshold, if they have more than 11 infections. So the county will release that data. So, there's this whole challenge that the country's facing in terms of contact tracing, data, public, just information about who's getting sick, when, and how fast are we getting to people in order to try to contain and mitigate outbreaks. I mean, that's just critical. And that's something that the country is still really kind of reeling from and dealing with, in that they haven't ever been able to do this efficiently. And the same goes for California. And so when you don't have that kind of industry data, you don't know where the cluster infections are. You don't know, just from people we talk to, just from a public health standpoint, it's critical to have that kind of information, just so you can begin making decisions around how to target your contact tracing efforts, for example. How to target testing, widespread testing when it was becoming available. If you had industry information, you could target testing to certain industries, prioritize it. But without that data, there's sort of a black hole of information. And another study that we looked at out of UC San Diego found that, in agricultural counties with farm workers, more people are dying of COVID-19. But the other thing that research found was that there are also people who are not at all, who are so off the map that they're dying at home, and they're potentially, they're not being counted essentially. And we know that a lot of farm workers, because they're undocumented, because they're reluctant to seek medical care, may be dying in those situations. So that's where there's truly an invisible kind of hidden toll that's playing out. But there is a push, I think researchers, everyone's public health experts, they're pushing for this data because it's critical, not only to knowing who's getting infected, how and when, but in figuring out ways to contain and mitigate the pandemic.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is that the particular nature of the Trump-Pence administration, their anti-science attitude, they've spread all of this disinformation and misinformation about really basic things about this virus and disease in general over the last months that have really, really hurt and compounded the way people are able to understand and act in this pandemic. It's a horrific crime being visited on the people here. And when you look at places countries where they have kind of, been more on top of the science and instituting some basic things, they've had remarkably different numbers of people dying in this pandemic and getting infected and stuff. And, the whole thing of having someone like Mike Pence, be in charge of the, pandemic and stuff is literally lunacy of a fascist nature. It's hard to get your head around how wrong things are right now, and again, how much is needed. And I really appreciate your film for really going out and shedding light on this. We mentioned these other films that you've done, and I was curious about how did you get into all of this? You were a journalism student. What steered you to reporting on immigrants and on people in these situations? Rape in the fields, rape, janitor, night shift, kids in the crackdown. What was your path to the work you do?
I think it's, I started in terms of my journalism career just with curiosity and, wanting to tell stories. I was actually a creative writing major as an undergrad, but, through where I am now, which is in this investigative place, and I'm doing films, and I started out, doing print, and I worked at a weekly, and I did long form print. And so, one editor at one point said, look, you don't have to have a beat. Just migrate to the stories that you're interested in. You don't have to, we don't have to define you. And I didn't want to define myself as an immigration reporter only, because I'm the daughter of immigrants. Do I need to always do immigration stories? Is that what's going to happen? I didn't want to be pigeonholed or tokenized that way. But I also, when I was at the Weekly and there was more of a range, I did all kinds of stories, but I also found myself migrating just in terms of my interest or what I care about to stories that were affecting people who were, also immigrants. And so that just naturally has been what has happened. But, for example, we did when I was at the Center for Investigative Reporting, we did an investigation that looked at solitary confinement, and we really concentrated the reporting on Rikers Island, because at the time, New York State and North Carolina were the only two states in the country that classified every 16-year-old teenager as an adult, no matter what the alleged offense. And so what that meant was that a lot of teenagers, as a lot of you New Yorkers know, but were ending up on Rikers Island, which is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a county jail. And a lot of people think of Rikers as like this prison, but it's not a prison. It's just a holding facility while your case is adjudicated. So we did this whole thing on solitary confinement. It had really nothing to do with immigration per se. But I really cared about, there's such extreme abuses out there in the world, such exploitation that is just, it's just, as a journalist, that's, it's hard to just, it's hard to just go to sleep at night. It's just hard to not do it for me. And so I think I've gradually migrated to these stories where the exploitation is so extreme. The thing with Rape on the Night Shift is you had women who were being sexually assaulted in office buildings, law offices, a doctor's office. I mean, just spaces where during the day, workers are inhabiting, thinking that this is just my, quiet old office, and you had violent assaults happening in some of these workplaces, and it's just the shock, just the sheer shock and absurdity of that. Just, we had to tell that story because it just needed to be known that this could be, a lot of people after we did Rape on the Night Shift, which is looking at the janitorial workforce, and that essentially the title says, with it's sexual assaults happening during the night shift. A lot of people were shocked and said, I never even looked at my janitor before. I'd never really considered them. And it's the same thing with the agricultural worker. It's like not considering people, just not considering their lives or what they're up against as the people who are doing so much essential work that's allowing you to do your own work. And then I think also, my own family, my mom herself at one point was a night shift janitor. So she is also part, she's like a background source for me. I go to her and ask her questions about things. And she's, I never thought about her life as a night shift janitor when I was in high school. Not really until I was doing Rape on the Night Shift did I think about her life as a janitor. And then as an adult, I went back and said, did anything like this ever happen to you? And she said, well, there was once a supervisor who was pursuing me and I got scared. And, but she knew, she went to the union. She got my dad involved. She sort of spoke up. And she said, though she was retaliated against, he gave her more work to do. He gave her the worst work to do. I mean, so that was real also for my mother. And so that, regardless of how you want to separate yourself, it's hard to separate yourself from your own narrative. When you think about, sometimes Andres, my co-producer, who couldn't be here today, he's actually sick, but sometimes we ask ourselves, why are we doing a story about, boys who are forced to work against their will at an egg farm in Ohio? Why are we doing this story? It's so difficult and nobody really wants to know. But it's like this thing that both of us have where we can't get away from the total injustice that surrounds that kind of scenario. You know, that was for our film Trafficked in America, where it's just like, you are processing everyone's eggs and you're a teenager who's getting your wages stolen by a trafficker. That's unacceptable. And so, you know, I think in terms of the journalism we do, it's really, you know, shedding light on and revealing these stories so that people can understand how these things play out in the US. You know, how can that happen here? You know, people ask that question, how can that be? How can that happen here? So part of our work is just showing you, this is how it happens. You know, here are the weaknesses in the law. Here are the weaknesses, you know, in the workplace. And this is how such a thing is able to happen. So that's a lot of our work. But so I think gradually I just couldn't not do this kind of work, as hard as it is and taxing as it can be sometimes, because the stories are dark and they're things that we don't necessarily want to know about. But I think a lot of our stories have a direct connection to the viewer who works in an office, the viewer who eats eggs, the viewer who eats broccoli, the viewer who consumes meat. I mean, all these human beings whose stories you're hearing about are actually directly connected to you often in some way.
Wow. Well, thank you for staying up at night and not going to sleep. There are so many people who are staying up at night, you know, and should be, you know, we should all be looking for what is reality? What is this world that we live in right now? And is there a way out? And that's, you know, I would recommend and urge everyone, that's what Revolution Books is all about. That, you know, yes, exposing the dark sides of the world that we live in, this capitalism that devours people, you know, and that can't help but do that. You know, people can look at, you know, the 5 stops, you know, 5 things that capitalism, you know, huge contradictions it can't resolve in any good way. You know, and the 2 choices Bob Avakian has put forward is either live with this and condemn future generations to the same or worse, or make revolution. And then also I would recommend the 6 points of attention, you know, that talk about how revolutionaries aspire to live today, how people can live today, but actually how people could live in their millions and billions in a fundamentally different kind of society, where people like these essential workers, you know, would be part of the humanity of, you know, that is going on, would be treated with respect, and would probably not be slaving all day, but would be taking part in changing the world. And there's actually, there's a constitution for a new socialist republic in North America that's authored by Bob Avakian that has a lot in it about this. And you know, the policies towards people, towards immigrants, the welcoming in of immigrants in what will be the future not United States, the future socialist republic. All of this is not an impossible dream, but something that we, you know, that we think is actually the only viable future and something to work for. And I would just recommend that people, you know, check out what Avakian's written, including on the COVID crisis and the deadly illusions of normalcy. You know, we don't want to go back to normal pre-COVID, you know, for farm workers and meatpacking workers, their lives were pretty horrible before the pandemic, you know. You know, that's not what we're aspiring to, you know, or what people do. Even in the face of right now, we need to stop this fascist regime. So this is my 2 cents. And, you know, I think, you know, for you, you know, this is a great contribution that you're making. Are you working on anything new that you can tell us about? Or you have any projects up your sleeve that you would like to do?
You know, it's such a, I mean, one of the things that was happening while we were doing the film is that everything would this never happened before. Everything would almost radically change every 3 weeks. You know, we had shelter in place, and then like 3 or 4 weeks later, it was like the revolution, and everyone was out in the street, and we were like, this is the story now. No one's gonna when we were all sheltering in place, part of why we thought it was necessary to do this story now is because we were doing very little. Most of us who were lucky enough, as hard as sheltering in place and quarantining is, those of us who are able to do it are the lucky ones. And so we were like, so because so many of us were sheltered in place, it was like all you were doing was you were at home and then you were getting food somehow. So your life became really kind of stripped down, and we thought this might be a moment when people might hear the story about food. And so we started working on it, and then there's a revolution and everyone's in the streets, and it's just like all over the country, and we're like, okay, no one's going to care about the food story anymore because this is the story now. And then, like, you know, 3 weeks after, but we kept going because we had to keep going. And then 3 weeks after that, it was like California reopened so fast, and everything reopened, and suddenly you had this tremendous surge, and it was like, oh my God, everything changed again because we're in the middle of a surge. And what was this going to mean? And then it actually, things came back around to this story because then you saw the infections ramp up, and you saw it, all the numbers, even though we don't have industry numbers, we have, you know, race and ethnicity numbers that are telling us that, you know, Black Americans and Latino Americans are disproportionately affected. In California, it's like, you know, Latinos are almost 60% of all infections. And so then you ask, well, where do they work? And then you see their service industry, which has been, you know, kind of shut down. It's not back to where it was. And then you have agriculture, which has had to keep going. And so you start putting all of these things together, but it's just like, so, you know, back to your original question, but so it was crazy because so everything keeps changing. So right now we're like, what's going to happen 3 weeks from now? How are things going to change again? I frankly, because I have a family, I have 2 small children, and that was like a relentless production process. You know, like I said, we usually take a year to 2 years to do a 1-hour film, like we just did in 3.5 months. And so it was weekends, it was 16-hour days. And so because I just finished, then I finally got like just a little sick, and just my body, you know, everything is recalibrating because I was really kind of in a zone trying to get this done. And so, you know, we're kind of looking at the elections. Frontline has a whole lineup of really good films coming up in the fall that are looking at everything from, you know, supply chain failure and PPE and the vaccine to, you know, The Choice, which is always really solid. Frontline, you know, sort of looking at the 2 candidates, just a lot of different films. Policing, we have another policing film coming out. So we do, you know, so I'm trying to think, okay, where are we going to be? Because I now wouldn't do something until probably for next year sometime. So it's hard to think about, though, how do you do it? Because it's so hard to actually do a story during COVID as a film. You know, we were able to have this incredible footage that our director of photography shot because a lot of it was outside. We shot like 95% of the film outside because we had to take our own protocols because we didn't want to become vectors and infect the people we were interviewing. We didn't want to become infected. And so there was all this, the safest thing to do that we understood at the time, and which basically still stands, is to be outside and to have that distance. And so, you know, it's hard to do a film indoors and not have it be all Zoom. And so, you know, so there are story ideas that I had. It's like there's the time we're living in. It's like there's pre-COVID and post, you know, and how does that story change now? You know, now, during, and eventually post, or in the changing COVID universe that we find ourselves in this country. So there's a couple of, you know, areas that I'm kind of, I had been looking at, you know, sort of brought, you know, there's medical racism that I'm interested in. It's a huge problem. It's playing out. It's been a huge problem. How does that play out? You know, what are the stories there? And how is that changing because of COVID? So that's one, for example, you know, but then there's, I mean, child sexual abuse. There are different stories that I was reporting on there, that different areas, like I said, kind of following interest areas. And then paying attention to this story. Would we do a follow-up? What's this going to look like 6 months from now? So we're still kind of talking and figuring out, and don't have the next film yet that I know what it's going to be, and really trying to pay attention to this story too as we kind of follow it up with print stories, on the Frontline website.
Speaking of this story, and of the courageous people who you interviewed, what has been their response to the finished film, and have you been following them through since then, in contact with them since then?
Yeah, so Cynthia Hernandez, who you met, who has cancer still, she's already been through. She lost the job that she had. She got another job packing, making cardboard boxes. She was getting up at 2 in to drive an hour and a half. Now she lost that job, and so she's in between jobs. I mean, it's stressful for her. And she's also, I mean, Cynthia's also a very strong advocate for herself and for farm workers. So she works, for example, she volunteers with an organization called Líderes Campesinas, and they were able to secure masks for workers at a certain point during our filming. She's active. We didn't know, she was very private about her health, and she ended up telling us, and obviously we leave the film with it because it's such a stark reality. We didn't know how she'd receive that. She didn't, our subjects don't see anything. They don't see the film before we put it out. And so when we checked in with her, she actually really loved it. And she felt, I think if you watch the film all the way through, her story and its arc is really powerful. And the end, which she's in, is she ends up finding herself in a potential COVID infection situation at her work site. I won't tell you what happens to her, so you can watch the film. But it's a very powerful arc, and I think it emboldened her and made her. One of the things she always would say to us is, "I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I work. I take pride in my work." But she also understands that there's so much working against her in terms of the options that she has. So she's become more empowered. She's doing a separate panel in Spanish, and her spirits are high, even though she's dealing with so much. The other characters in the film, the ones in the meatpacking plant, are still working there. OSHA came and investigated. They said they're still, that situation is only gradually getting better. There's also a class action lawsuit filed against Central Valley Meat because of the way the outbreak played out at that company. So we are checking in with everyone. Yeah, we sort of text and check in because we're in a surge. I mean, the situation is dire for everyone. So, I write to Mari Cruz, and there have been no infections at her work site yet, but she's had family members who have gotten sick. So, everyone is dealing with it, and everyone is having their situation change weekly. But I think for Cynthia, the film actually made her. I think we were trying very hard to demonstrate how much agency she has and wants to have, as someone who's aware of her rights and knows that some of these things aren't right. So yeah, I mean we're in touch with people from our other films too. We just check in with them because they're important to the story. So you just kind of keep in touch.
Tremendously important stories, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Stay well and continue to do it through all of the crises. So this is Daffodil Altan. You can see her work on PBS Frontline, and please check in with Revolution Books and find out about the program that we're doing and some things coming right up. If you look at Revolution Books in Berkeley's Facebook page, we are doing sort of a guerrilla solo cello concert against a Trump fascist regime on Monday at the post office. So, so for that and everything else, yeah, check back with our bookstore. Thank you so much. Katie, I think we want to say goodbye to our Facebook audience now. And thank you so much for viewing.